I want to unpack a little bit more about what it means to unmix the gospel. If Jesus came to fulfill the law and not to abolish it, and that's what he said in Matthew 5:17 and 18, why does the book of Hebrews say the law is obsolete? Which it does in Hebrews 8:13. I want to quickly establish why knowledge and law in the way that we try to live our life in God are old covenant ways of trying to relate to God. I want to talk about this in 3 categories. I'll spend one session on each. I'm going to kind of capture them all in this session. I'll talk about relationship versus rules, knowing versus knowledge, and grace versus law. I already indicated the net effect of our lack of experience of life in the Spirit in the new covenant causes us to say that, to interpret 2 Corinthians 5:17 in that kind of negative way. If anyone's in Christ, hang in there. It's just going to be hard, but you'll get through it. And, you know, we just love you, brother, and wish the best for you. I'm going through it too. Yeah, and that's our version of stirring one another up in good works. Just grit your teeth, bite down on that bullet. This is a bummer, but we're all doing the best we can. That's the good news. Is it any wonder people are running away from the church? Because it's not just that that's what we teach, that's how we live. And we relate to them out of the judgment of that. We're actually doing poorly ourselves, but we feel so bad about it that when we see them doing poorly, we make sure they know they're screwed up. What a mess you are. Come to Jesus. Do you know Jesus? Yeah, and it's miserable, right? I mean, that's kind of what, so come on, join the misery. Misery loves company. I mean, that's, God forgive me, right? You all know what I'm saying. We have a mixed understanding of relationship versus rules, of knowing versus knowledge, and of grace versus law. And so we mix these, and then we act surprised when we get mixed results. Are the promises of abundance, transformation, union with Christ, authority, health, all those things, are they really meant to just kind of tease you in this life and disappoint you? Is that the game God is playing? Some of you may be familiar with a man named Paul Cain. He had a famous, very prophetically gifted man, passed away in 2019, just the last couple years. He had a famous line. It was always so potent that the Lord had showed him. He said, "To a people without mixture, I'll give my spirit without measure." But most people heard that as, I got to get my life cleaned up because I've got too much mixture and therefore I can't have all of the Spirit. And Paul privately confided in a friend of mine. He said, people have always gotten that wrong. What the Lord was showing me is, to a people without mixture of law and grace, I'll give my Spirit without measure. But we mix law and grace because law is our comfortable spot. Most of us are raised under the law. Natural parenting is a law, right? No, no, no. Don't do that. Don't touch that. Stop that. I mean, that's what you have to do as a parent. So God is showing us in natural history, there's degrees of that are part of instilling something needed to come to maturity. But if you don't see your child actually own that for themselves, right? What's your greatest blessing as a parent? It's when you see your child internalize those values. And that's such an imperfect, natural picture. Now let's go to the old Adam and the new Adam a heart of stone and a heart of flesh, a covenant of law and a covenant of grace, and we can't actually mix those and get a pure result. Paul said in Galatians 2:20, I've been crucified with Christ. Therefore, it is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life which I now live, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. I'm going to look at this and many other verses tomorrow. But this is another one like 2 Corinthians 5:17. We don't read this with the clarity and forcefulness with which Paul said it. He is making a definitive past tense statement about a present tense reality. Paul is standing in front of an audience and saying, I've been crucified with Christ. Now, anyone alive at that time would have looked and said, Paul, we know your story. You actually persecuted the church. You didn't come until you were knocked off your high horse. God did something in you, and then you got a different life and a different story. But you weren't, there were two thieves, one on either side of Jesus. You weren't even in the picture at that time. Paul said, I was crucified with him. We have to get this. We have to understand this. A friend of mine, Stuart Greaves, had a dream where he was preaching the grace of God in the dream with such strength and such potency, and people were getting liberated, and he felt that invisible barrier of, I might be going too hard on this. I might be pushing it too far. And he started to back off and back away. Paul was relentless. For 5 chapters in the book of Romans, he made such a case that the only conclusion could be Romans 6:1. Wait a second, Paul, are you telling us we should continue in sin that grace would abound? Because he's actually talked about the glories of grace abounding far more over the abundance of sin. And wherever sin is happening, God's answer is more grace. And the overdoing it, the fear of overdoing it, is called antinomianism. And antinomianism has gripped the church. We preach a very light grace because we don't want people to take advantage of it. And no one is actually saying, are you saying we should sin because grace will abound? But Paul preached to the Romans in such a way that was the only conclusion. It was so fearless, so bold, so relentless. He knew what they were thinking and he anticipated it. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking I'm saying, well, if grace is that good and grace is that strong, just keep on sinning so the grace will increase. And he answers the question, no, may it never be. How shall we who died to sin live any longer therein? And he develops a theology of death to sin and death to the law so that Romans 8, we can walk in newness of life. But he didn't water down the new covenant gospel of grace to get there. It's the only way you can get there. He told the Galatians, having begun by the Spirit, are you now being perfected by the flesh? If you live by the Spirit, you are not under the law. If you live by the Spirit, you are not under the law. Why do you keep returning to the law? If you're returning to the law, you aren't under the Spirit. If you're under the Spirit, you aren't under the law. Romans 11:6. If it is by grace, it is no longer on the basis of works. Otherwise, grace would no longer be grace. Either it's you and what you do, or it's grace and what he's done. And we cannot mix those two and move into maturity.